Greetings and welcome to another great episode of our Black Gay Diaspora podcast. I'm your host, Erick, and for this conversation, I am joined by Rinaldo Walcott, who is a Canadian academic and writer. Rinaldo is professor and chair of Africana and American Studies at the University of Buffalo in Buffalo, New York. He holds the Carl V. Granger Chair in Africana and American Studies. Thank you to episode 98's Lyndon K. Gill for connecting us. As a writer and critic, Rinaldo's research is in Black diaspora cultural studies, gender and sexuality, with interests in nations, nationalisms, multiculturalism, policy, and education. His published works include 2021's The Long Emancipation, Moving Toward Black Freedom, as well as On Property. In 2019, Rinaldo published Black Life, Post-BLM, and the Struggle for Freedom. There is 2016's Queer Returns, Essays on Multiculturalism, Diaspora and Black Studies, Black Like Who, Writing Black Canada, which was published in 1997 and again in 2003. Throughout his career, Mr. Walcott has also written articles for scholarly journals and books, newspapers, and magazines. I have to admit, I am ready and a little nervous for education. I have been doing my research, of course, on Rinaldo, and just am intrigued and look forward to discovering more of who he is, his literary contributions, and how he educates us on being better citizens. Greetings, Rinaldo, and welcome. How are you?
I'm well, Erick. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for joining me. So how are you?
I'm well. It's cold. It's really cold today. It was snowing for the last 2 days in Buffalo. Today, it is mostly blue sky with some clouds, but very cold. I have learned that there are like these micro climates in parts of Buffalo. So sometimes the suburbs might get all the snow where I am downtown might not get any. It depends.
Yeah, I've been to Toronto once, which I know you were before your position in New York. I was there in 2019, February. That is the coldest place I've ever experienced.
Really?
Coming from Arizona and California, so.
I know, but you lived in Sweden for a while, right?
You know what? If I'm honest, it was the way I was dressed because I came from LA for like a 5-day visit. Okay, thank you for checking me. Yes, because I do remember I went there. It was an Afro-vegan fair, and I got off the bus wherever it was, and on the way there, the 10-minute walk, I was like, I'm pretty sure my ears are going to fall off right now because I didn't have any protection.
Your California dress will not hold up in February in Toronto or Buffalo.
No, my fingers, my toes, all of that. Realize that.
Yeah. Most of the East Coast.
Very much that. Again, I want to thank Lyndon K. Gill for connecting us. When I interviewed him for episode 98 of this podcast, you were one of the top people that he suggested I reach out to. What is your professional connection with Lyndon? Have you guys worked together?
I first met Lyndon when he was a graduate student at Harvard. He was finishing up his doctorate, and he wanted to come to Toronto to talk to some people and to engage with the Black diaspora queer scene there. That's how we first met. And we've stayed in touch all these years later and become friends and interlocutors. I pushed him, he pushed me to try to think better about what it means to be Black and queer, to be suspicious of the institutions that we make our livings in, to think about what it means to make Black community questions of spirituality. He being very much influenced by certain Black spiritual practice and me being entirely skeptical of it. So that creates a useful and interesting intellectual and political tension. And then most of all, the best thing is he makes me laugh. When I'm in his company, I feel great joy and happiness.
I know what you're doing now, but if we could just backtrack a little, what is your educational background?
I moved from Barbados, where I was born as a teenager, to Canada, Toronto. So I finished my high school in Toronto, did my undergraduate studies at a university in Toronto called York University, did my graduate studies, my master's and my PhD at a place called the Ontario Institute of Studies and Education, which was affiliated with the University of Toronto, but which now is entirely a part of the University of Toronto. My undergraduate studies were in English literature and Caribbean studies, and my graduate work was in sociology. A sociologist by training, but I don't think the field of sociology would ever claim me as one of them. And I'm proud of that.
Did you know either during or after you had finished your academic studies what you were going to pursue professionally?
No, I mean, I pretty much went to graduate school as a way to preempt going into the workforce full time. It was while in graduate school, it became clear to me that I like reading, I like writing, and I like thinking. And it also became clear to me that there was something called a professor who did that as a part of their living and their everyday life. And that's when I thought that I would pursue becoming a professor. But I also pursued it with the knowledge that there are very few jobs in the profession, very few Black people, very few Black queer people. It was never like a singular goal for me. It just worked out that way.
So, your position at the University of Buffalo, professor and chair of Africana and American Studies, what does that role entail?
I think the most important thing about that role for me is that I've been doing it now for a little over 2 years. I'm the chair of the department. We're a small interdisciplinary department with a focus on diaspora and transnational Black studies. You know, we're really interested in what happens in the US and how that articulates, lines up, differs from Black life elsewhere in the world. So I have colleagues who work on the Caribbean, I have colleagues who work very locally on Buffalo and Erie County. I have colleagues who work on other parts of the US. I have colleagues who work on Africa, colleagues who work on Canada, like myself. So we're really interested in the broad sweep of Black life globally.
Did you have a similar role at other universities?
I've been chair of departments. The university that I worked at before, which I've worked the longest at, was the University of Toronto, where I worked for like 20 or 21 years. Didn't have a Black Studies department, but I served as the director of the Department of Women and Gender Studies for 5 years. Prior to that, I served for 3 years as the chair of a department at the time that was called the Department of Sociology and Equity Studies. This is my third time chairing a department. This time it's a little bit special because I always wanted to be in a Black Studies department. This opportunity has created that context, and to chair a department that has a long history but also has a choppy history, and my chairing it is another moment of its reemergence, so to speak. I'm enjoying it.
What do you mean by the history being choppy?
The Department of African and American Studies at the University of Buffalo was first founded in 1970 or 1971 as an African American Studies program. Then it became a Black Studies program. And it's been through various reinventions since 1970. It's been a department, then it's been a program, then it's been joined with other departments. And just before I arrived there, it was a part of a department called Transnational Studies that included a number of different other things like Indigenous Studies, Global Gender Studies, and then each of those became their own department. Indigenous Studies became its own department, and Global Gender and Sexuality Studies became its own department. And that left really Africana and American Studies as two units on their own. So they're reinventing themselves as Africana and American Studies.
With you being Canadian and also from Barbados, what have you been able to do to broaden the American or Black Americans' perspective of what it means to be Black?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say that that's my task to broaden that because I think at least the African Americans that I encounter, have a pretty wide view of Black life in the world. As you know, and as we know, there's no singular African American experience either. That somebody from the East Coast might have a very different relationship to their Blackness, somebody from the South or somebody from the West Coast, and so on. My task as a scholar and a thinker is, as I was saying earlier, to kind of figure out the moments where Black life from these other geographies are similar, for lack of a better word, where they coincide with certain kinds of experiences, and where they differ, and what does that mean for how we experience our Blackness in the very local conditions within which we live our everyday lives. The work that I do, I find that, for example, there's certain kinds of things that we see among Black communities, especially in what we might call the West. You know, whether it's Canada or the US, we see high rates of poverty. Whether it's Canada or the US, we see forms of police brutality. Whether it's Canada or the US, we see limited access to certain kinds of employment and so on. Having made those comparisons and noticed those kinds of indices or trends or historical patterns, there are other ways in which people also experience their Blackness in their own localities. So, for instance, in Canada, you know, the discourse of multiculturalism tends to prohibit many people, many Black people, from talking about the kind of national Black community. While in the US, it's much more easier to invoke some notion of a national Black community, even though there are regional differences and so on. There are those kinds of interesting differences, tensions, and moments that also coalesce. And that's what I'm always really interested in pursuing and having conversations about. That's what my teaching and my research pursues.
Okay. Yeah, I'm currently halfway through Black Like Who. The first thing was when I started reading it was, because this podcast it's coming up on 4 years and it has the name Diaspora in it, to have read this book before then, because the title right away drew me in. Black Like Who? Like, let's dissect that for me in my own personal internal dialogue. But what sparked the idea for you to do this particular project?
Well, as you know, I was born in Barbados, but pretty much became an adult in the Canadian context. I really wanted to make sense of what did it mean to be a Black person in Canada? What were the kinds of histories and the kinds of knowledges that exist prior to people like myself who are of Caribbean descent, but grew up in Canada, how we could make sense to what it meant to be Black in that geopolitical space. And that's what sparked Black Like Who, was trying to kind of figure out how to talk about and how to think about Blackness in Canada in between a much longer history of Black people in Canada, between that and between the ever present dominant presence of African American Blackness. And so that led me to, again, kind of looking around and thinking about, well, where are some other places where Blackness is also experienced through a certain kind of link to the Caribbean? And of course, the obvious place for me was the UK, Britain. A lot of my thinking is influenced by the Black British thinker and scholar Paul Gilroy, or the Black British US scholar Hazel Carby, Stuart Hall, the Caribbean British scholar. What I was trying to really pursue is, what are the moments that the kind of national project of any specific nation, but in that case, Canada, cuts Black people off from making important and crucial connections with other Black people. And so the idea of diaspora was really important to me at that particular time, and continues to be, because one of the things that I pursue in my work a lot is what kinds of connections and what kinds of political formations Black people can make that are not subordinated to the nation states where we live. And diaspora, as an idea, as a term, as a concept, allows me to make those links. I'm very interested in what circulates among Black people across national boundaries, and how those things that circulate, whether it's music, whether it's film, whether it's dance, whether it's the way we dress, whether it's the way we talk, whether it's the way we carry our bodies, how those things allow Black people to make communities and political formations beyond the confines of the nation state. So Black Like Who was my first attempt to try to articulate that kind of connectedness.
You also the cover photo, which I know you talk about it in the beginning of the book, but the connection between the United States and Canada with that.
Well, that photograph is an interesting photograph, and there's been some controversy about it. But I chose it because it really opened up the space about thinking about how we're not captured by nations, even though we make demands of them. The Niagara movement, which later transforms itself into the NAACP. The thing about that photograph is that they come up to where we are, Niagara Falls, Erie County, to meet. There's some debate about whether or not they are able to get accommodations. So they apparently meet on the Canadian side for a bit. Some people have now claimed that that kind of history is not particularly correct and accurate, but nonetheless, that's what that photograph encapsulated for me. And the reason I chose it was for exactly those tensions and contradictions. Even as Black people make demands of a particular nation where they are located, often have to be looking elsewhere because there's no particular nation state that I know of yet that really makes it safe for Black existence to fully come into its own, to fully come into its being. That photograph really encapsulates many of those contradictions and tensions and concerns. But it also, importantly enough, the debate was that when the leaders of the Niagara movement were meeting, Black Canadians who were living close to the Niagara border wanted to attend those meetings. They were refused attendance.
I think of my travels so far, particularly in the UK and even in Sweden, always wondering who people see when I'm in these spaces, either people who look similar to me or people outside of that. Who do they see or what are they perceiving? Yeah.
That's the thing about Blackness, right? At the level of phenotype, skin color, it immediately seems to suggest some kind of common endeavor, some kind of common bond. And then we open our mouths and we start to talk to each other. And an entirely different, an entirely different possibility announces itself. And it's not to say that that doesn't happen for other people who are marked as racial groups too. But I think for us, I think for Black people globally, the assumption that we're just going to fold into each other nicely and without contradiction has been a really powerful myth, and one that we continually have to work against, even as we work to build solidarity and connection.
Just from my reference point as American, because I've been to South Africa and Botswana, but in particular with South Africa, and I remember Black and non-Black Americans like, did you feel like you were at home when you arrived? I'm like, no, I felt like a foreigner, like I feel anywhere else I go. I didn't drop to my knees and start weeping with joy, like I am home. And then two, just erasing the history of like where I know my African history comes from, and it's not from that part of the continent.
When I've talked about going to South Africa, there are other Black people who said to me, well, you've not been to the real Africa yet. Right? Okay. And the real Africa gets positioned as the West Coast of Africa. And that's what I mean, that these contradictions, the ways in which people imagine connection. Diaspora is for me a really important idea to hold on to for that. It holds all of us together, but it doesn't meld us into one.
You mentioned that you're originally from Barbados, but who were you when you landed in Canada as far as your awareness of things?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, when I landed in Canada, I would say that I knew more about Canada than Canada up to this day would actually know about somebody like me. That has a lot to do with the kinds of shared colonial histories coming out of a place like Barbados, which was colonized by the British. Going to school in Barbados, we learned about Canada. We learned about the Grand Banks. We learned about Nova Scotia. We learned about the St. Lawrence Seaway and Montreal. We learned about Jackie Robinson being in Montreal to play baseball in the 1940s and so on. I mean, of course, we knew that a lot of the salted cod that was served to the enslaved in the Caribbean came from Nova Scotia, from the Grand Banks, and so on. I recall vividly as a teenager that many of the white people that I met, what they knew of the Caribbean was as a holiday place, a place where it was always sunny. So there was a kind of disconnect as I became more aware of the relationship between race and politics and place that led to me writing something like Black Like Who. Because for a while in Canada, there's either Caribbean or African American. So even though Canada had many long-standing Black communities, they were often made to be disappeared by people asserting that there were no homegrown Black people. So Black Montreal got disappeared, Black Halifax got disappeared, Black Cape Breton got disappeared, the Black communities out west in Canada got disappeared, the Black communities in parts of Ontario, like Niagara Falls, Grey County, and so on. And so as I became an adult, I wanted to understand what underwrote that disappearance. And of course, the fundamental thing that underwrites that disappearance is that Canada imagines itself as a white country. It does not imagine itself as a multiracial country like the US does. In the 60s and the 70s, Canada reimagined itself as a multicultural nation. But it reimagined itself as a multicultural nation by saying, now we're adding these Black and brown and other people to what is essentially a white nation. And Canada continues to imagine itself as a white nation, despite indigenous resurgence.
I definitely can get that and think of my own images of Canada before I went the first time. I think of the invisible visible. So these people that could have been around you the whole time, you didn't really see them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. There've been Black people in Canada from before the entity that we now call Canada was called Canada, right? When it was the British North American colonies, there was slavery in parts of Canada, but particularly in Montreal, when what is now called Quebec was a part of the French colonies. The nation has a very long history of Black people and a Black presence. But if you were to go by the story of multiculturalism, Black people really only showed up in Canada after World War II, after 1945. It's an absolute lie. And of course, there were Black battalions in the First and Second World War and so on. Thinkers, writers, people who are the descendants of those people have to continually reassert that presence and have to continually reassert their long history of attachment to the nation state of Canada.
Yeah, in reading what I've read so far of that particular book, Dionne Brand, she's on my list now because you reference her.
Yeah, Dionne Brand, Maxine Tynes, a range of writers and thinkers and poets and novelists, historians who have done the important work of not simply recovering the long history of Black life in Canada, but providing us the intellectual tools to maintain that conversation over time. When I wrote Black Life in 1997, the conversation about Black life in Canada was very different from it than it is right now. It is more difficult to deny that longer presence, but that longer presence is now configured into interesting kinds of moments of, did you know this history? That kind of rhetoric, right? Did you know this? As though it's a kind of a surprise.
It makes me think of, I interviewed a guest, American writer, Delano Burrows, and he's, I think, from Massachusetts. And I want to ask you, because I know some of your work is connected to when the whole thing exploded with the murder of George Floyd. that, all of a sudden white people around him wanted to talk about how they felt about, oh my God, I didn't know this was going on. But when he wanted to share his own experiences, like that's been going on here the whole time, that they were, that's a little too personal. I don't know if I want to go there with you on that.
Well, it becomes too close to home. So in 97, when I write Black White Who, that's a period of time where police violence and police killings of Black people in Canada, especially in Canada's largest city, Toronto, had occurred many times prior. In 1992, there's a riot on Yonge Street that's a response to police shooting of a Black man, but also in solidarity and sympathy with what was happening in LA in 1992 around the Rodney King beating and the acquittal of the police officers there. By 2014, with the movement for Black Lives, that movement made sense as Black people in Canada lined up with and shared in the same kind of feeling that Black people in the US were experiencing, because again, Black people were being killed, shot by the police in Toronto and other parts of Canada. In those moments, one begins to see how a certain perspective around what constitutes other people's response to Blackness produces a Black global feeling. Police violence is definitely one of those things that produces that Black global feeling. That everywhere we look in the Western world, whether we're looking at France, we're looking at the UK, we're looking at the US, whether we're looking at Sweden, Belgium, you name it, you can find police violence that's animating the lives of Black people, and therefore forcing us to take to the streets, forcing us to engage in other forms of activism to prohibit what can often lead to death. Because police violence takes a wide array of practices, with death being the ultimate outcome. I was really interested as a scholar and a thinker to look at what was happening and begin to make sense of it. And that's when I wrote that short book with Idil Abdullahi. We write less about police violence in that book and more about what are the conditions that lead to the attitudes that will allow for Black people's lives to be worth less, especially encounters with policing. By 2020, when George Floyd is so spectacularly killed in front of many people as they saw it on their TVs, as we were in lockdown because of COVID, I then wrote the On Property book, which is a book that was meant to intervene into why it is that prison and police abolition becomes an important political and activist stance. It was very much related to my book, The Long Emancipation, in that on property, I wanted to demonstrate that the project of abolition was not over, and that the project of abolition that began with slavery and began in slavery and began with slave revolt and rebellion and so on, continued into the present to abolish prisons and policing and so on. And that lines up very well alongside the argument that I tried to make in the Long Emancipation, that Black people globally live in the time of emancipation, and that we often use emancipation interchangeably with freedom, but they're not the same. So I say that we still live in the time of emancipation, and the time of emancipation is a time that interrupts the project of abolition, because abolition in its most radical form is freedom. Emancipation in its juridical and legislative form interrupts abolition as a way of saying that we have now set you free, but we set you free under this set of terms. Abolition calls for you setting the terms for your freedom yourself. And that is the difficult and dangerous rupture. A lot of our political time as Black people globally is spent trying to find ways to be enfolded into systems and practices that were not constructed for us to be enfolded in. So we spend a lot of time struggling to be included into things that we can only fail at. when our real task, it seems to me, to be dogmatic about it, is our energy should be spent trying to figure out how to rupture these processes so that we can build some new ones, so that we can make ones that are authentically about the project of all of us being able to live the kinds of lives that we should be able to live to the fullest of our abilities and capabilities. To me, abolition is that kind of project.
Thank you for that. Yeah, because I did catch your April 2023 interview with Left of Bank web series, and just what you just talked about just now. It's like I use humor, but it's like I want to be able to walk around in this body and not have to be always like a spy, always scoping the
Yeah,
landscape.
I mean, yeah, I think the Left of Black interviews with Professor Mark Anthony Neal. The strange thing about being Black in this world that we inhabit, especially the parts of the world that we inhabit where a logic of whiteness understands us to be always trespassing, is that it's really dangerous to walk around and forget that we're Black. But knowing that means then that we are also hyper aware of all of the ways in which the fictive narratives of freedom, of self determination, of self ownership don't actually work. We can so spectacularize how the forces of oppression shape our everyday experiences. That we know that when people are talking about, oh, you're free to do whatever you want to do and so on, that they're talking bullshit. Because we know that a simple wrong turn down a street could lead to anything from harassment to death. That's powerful as a kind of frame to thinking about what it is we need to build. If we could walk around and not be worried that a wrong turn is going to lead to anything from harassment to death, then there is some transformation that has taken place.
Mm.
Then we're into a whole different set of social relations. It's not willy-nilly when Black activists say no one will be free until we're all free. They're speaking from that site of containment. We're able to use that position of containment to begin to imagine another world, a different set of social relations, a different set of political arrangements, different ways of experiencing and expressing what our cultural connections could be, should be, and might be.
Do you find with the knowledge that you share that it influences how you view other forms of media like film and television?
I write about film, I write about art, I write about literature. What I would say is that, I come to these questions always trying to figure out what is at stake for the kind of ethical and moral demands that are necessary to make a world where all people can live freely, can come into the self that they want to come into without harming others. Forms of expressive culture are the glue that both holds us together, but that also offers us insight into what that different living might be. And that's why earlier when I said to you that, one of the things about diaspora that's important to me is what circulates. The literature and the films and the music that circulates that allows us to begin to see something of the other in the other. It allows us to make these particular kinds of connections that are both tangible and intangible, that are symbolic and pressingly felt as well. And so I see myself as a scholar and a critic trying to help us to see or participating in conversations that help us to see what work those forms of connection might do. Those forms of connection can be fleeting, but they can also be historically sustaining in ways that lay the groundwork for new ways of being to come into the world. We can take hip hop as one example of how Black people have connected globally. We can take an early iteration of a figure like Bob Marley and reggae as another instance of that. We can take the great footballer Pele from Brazil as another moment of that. They're both tangibly material and symbolic in the sense that the invocation of them invokes something more than the individual. It invokes a way of being, a sense of connection, some idea of belonging to each other in ways that give joy.
It's funny you say that. My awareness is in real time of Black people in Canada was around the time that you wrote Black Like Who, when I discovered like Deborah Cox and other singers who were coming up at that time. And I was like, oh, well, of course there's Black people in Canada. Duh. Yeah.
I think about the way in which my encounters with Marlon Riggs films helped shape me, but I also think about how my encounters with the films of Isaac Julian, Black British, shaped me. I think about the first time I read Paul Gilroy's important book, There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, how my encounter with what he had to say about Blackness in relationship to the British and UK project seemed to resonate with how I was experiencing or thinking about Blackness in the Canadian context. The things that we make, whether it's a novel, whether it's a poem, whether it's a song, whether it's a film, whether it's an artwork, those things become the basis for deeper reflections on who we are and might be. They also become the basis of forms of identification that might work to produce connection. Cultural form, whether it's a TV show, is really important for how we begin to define what's my Blackness in relationship to yours. And so I have nothing but respect for people who make art. And by art, I mean art widely defined, from literature to visual art to film to dance to music, theater, you name it.
Speaking of which, for you, when did you know that you not only had something to say, but you had the gifts and the tools to do it?
I don't know if I have something to say and the gifts and the tools to do it. What I would say is that I am determined to be a part of trying to produce a better conversation of how we can live together. It would go back to what I said to you earlier that, when I went to grad school, I kind of realized, oh, there's this thing called reading, writing, and thinking, and it can be a decent job. It was in that recognition that I thought, okay, so maybe I can pursue being a professor. But I also thought, well, that might not work out. And what else can I do? And I think that I probably would have found myself doing something related to the world of art, broadly defined. The production of ideas is really useful in terms of shaping social relations. The more and better ideas we have to work with, the better people we become. I'm committed to a project of what does it mean for us to collectively try to become better people? And what are the things that we need to create to make that happen? And so for me, part of that is conversation. I believe in talk. I believe that the more we talk to each other, the better people we potentially can become.
I don't want to forget this because it is the second on my list of your books to read, is Queer Returns, Essays on Multiculturalism, Diaspora and Black Studies. But can you share about that book?
Yeah, so Queer Returns is a collection of essays that I had written over the years, and they were scattered in many different places in academic journals and other kinds of things. each of them is an essay that's written either thinking about Black studies, thinking about queerness, thinking about how multiculturalism in Canada both prohibits and prescribes what it is we might talk and think about. But also queer to me, at least Black queer, it to me is very much like diaspora, which is that, we kind of share something in common, which is about sexual practice and desire, but we also might not. So queer is this interesting container to hold us together and hold us into one with many kind of differences. With diasporas, there's always this idea that we're going to return to the original homeland. And so with queer returns, I was playing with this idea of what does it mean to return to queer as a way to think about some questions in Black studies and in multicultural studies and in diaspora studies. Because in all three of those studies, often what falls out of them is queer experience, queer sociality, and queer personality. Black studies still finds itself being tremendously straight. Multiculturalism finds itself locked in on race, but often evading sexuality. And diaspora studies is itself sometimes and often also very hung up on queer sexuality, unable to go there in all kinds of ways. That book, Queer Returns, explores those kinds of tensions and contradictions. And for me, bringing those essays together was, an attempt to say these questions, these concerns are worth pursuing, they're worth asking, they're worth engaging with, they're worth taking the risk of putting them out there for others to think with and to think against.
It makes me think in my travels so far, especially with connecting with other Black people wherever I've been, and Black queer people in particular, that it reinforces that I'm born this way, especially with men, those of us who identify as gay men, those things where I've been in South Africa, and apart from, like you said, the sexual practices and who I'm attracted to, but the humor and those types of things, it's been interesting to me how wherever I've been, it's like, oh, it's kind of similar to what I know.
That moment of recognition that makes you notice something about yourself.
Yeah, very much that. Yeah. Do you have any upcoming or current projects that you would like to share about?
25 years ago, there was a conference organized by E. Patrick Johnson from Northwestern University, who's not Northwestern University, and a scholar called May Henderson, called Black Queer Studies in the New Millennium. And that conference led to a book called The Black Queer Studies Reader. Black Queer Studies, an introduction, sorry. In April 4 to 6, in Chapel Hill at UNC, we're coming together 25 years after, and to again think about what has changed in the 25 years that we first met. What are still the tensions between Black studies and queer studies? What's the place of Black queer studies in the intellectual and artistic life of the US, and so on? So that's what's on the horizon for me in the very near future. Yeah.
I think I said in the beginning when I started to read Black Like Who, in some ways I'm grateful that I just dove into this platform. If I would have started it, if I felt like I needed to really be educated in some ways. But now that I've discovered you and Lyndon and others, it's just definitely encouraged me to just dive deeper and to continue to expand my awareness of who I am and who we are. So thank you so much for joining me on this platform.
Thank you for having me. And like I said, it's part of the conversation. We're in a conversation and we're learning from each other as we go along. So thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Where can we engage with you online?
I post stuff at Blue Sky, mainly food, at Blacklight Who on Instagram. It's my adventures eating out and my cooking.
I forgot to ask, this is always a question I do end with. You've shared so much, but if you do have any final thoughts or insights.
No, I mean, I think, yeah, I'm good.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Thank you for spending time with us. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, comment, and subscribe. Share with your friends too. You can also follow us on Instagram at Our Black Gay Diaspora and on Twitter at BLK Gay Diaspora. Until next time.